This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Haymarket Books, which has loads of great left-wing titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is We Do This Till We Free Us, Abolitionist Organizing and Transforming Justice by Mariame Kaba. What if ordinary people have the power to collectively free ourselves? In this timely collection of essays and interviews, Mariame Kaba reflects on the deep work of abolition and transformative political struggle. With a foreword by Naomi Murakawa and a chapter on seeking justice beyond the punishment system, transforming how we deal with harm and accountability, and finding hope in collective struggle for abolition, Kaba's work is deeply rooted in the relentless belief that we can fundamentally change the world. As Kaba writes, nothing that we do that is worthwhile is done alone. As Eve Ewing says of the book, I want to say this is a generation-defining book, but that feels wrong because I know it will be shaping political imaginations for a century or more. It's generations defining. This is a classic in the vein of Sister Outsider, a book that will spark countless radical imaginations. We Do This Till We Free Us, Abolitionist Organizing and Transforming Justice by Mariame Kaba, out now from Haymarket Books. Welcome to The Dig, a podcast from Jacobin Magazine. My name is Daniel Denver, and I'm broadcasting from Providence, Rhode Island. This week is a special crossover on Asian American politics with Andy Liu, Caspian Kang, and Tammy Kim, the hosts of a really excellent podcast that I listen to constantly called Time to Say Goodbye. It's a podcast about all things Asian American, and really also just about all things. Anyhow, the bipartisan new Cold War with China, the Trumpian right-wing xenophobic COVID rhetoric, brutal street assaults, and, most horrifically, the Atlanta murders have all put anti-Asian racism and xenophobia front and center. Meanwhile, more Asian Americans voted for Trump in 2020 than in 2016, after years of shifting toward the Democratic Party. But in the Democratic primary, Asian Americans supported Bernie Sanders in huge numbers. Where do Asian Americans fit into American politics and into an American racial hierarchy often defined by a black-white binary? Or is the very category of Asian Americans part of the problem, this notion that immigrants from or descendants from China, Japan, the Philippines, India, Korea, Vietnam, and more, that they're all part of one homogenous group, that poor, working class, middle class, and rich people all have something in common by virtue of Asianness? We discuss all of that and more. Before we get started, this podcast is listener supported, and the place for listeners like you to support us is at patreon.com/thedig. We have books, we have mugs, tote bags to give away. But the real reason that I'm asking you to support this podcast is because it is support from listeners like you that allow us to put all of these episodes out there with nothing ever paywalled so that everyone, regardless of their ability to pay, can listen to everything, which is extremely important to us. So if you haven't done so yet and you can afford to, please do support us at patreon.com/thedig. That's patreon.com/thedig. Also, please sign up for the last Dig Book Club event this April 18th with Charisse Burden-Stelly by visiting thedigradio.com/dig-book-club. We set up the book club a little under a year ago to bring listeners together during this pandemic, and it's been really fun and great, but everyone is totally zoomed out. So thank you to everyone who participated, and we will certainly be doing more listener events in the future, just not a regular book club. But we very much encourage any of you out there who want to form Dig book clubs to read alongside the show with your friends and comrades to do so. Or if anyone out there has ever wanted to start a Dig Discord or something like that, I've never used a Discord, but I hear that is a place where people gather to discuss podcasts. If you want to establish a Dig Discord, please do go for it. All right, here we go. Andy Liu is a historian of modern China and the author of Tea War, A History of Capitalism in China and India. Tammy Kim is a freelance writer, a contributor to New York Times Opinion, and a former lawyer who likes to organize workers. Caspian Kang is a writer-at-large for New York Times Magazine. His new book, The Loneliest Americans, will be published this fall. Andy Liu, Caspian Kang, Tammy Kim, and time to say goodbye, listeners listening to my podcast for the first time. Welcome to The Dig.
Hey, Dan.
Hey. Thanks for having us.
The Georgia murders have been linked to a broader wave of hate crimes against Asians, but many of the most high-profile street attacks caught on video appear to have been perpetrated by homeless people with mental illness. There's no doubt that Trump's Kung flu, China virus, and the entire bipartisan new Cold War with China nurtures anti-Asian racism in the United States. But do Trumpian racism, the Georgia killer, and homeless mentally ill people add up to something bigger? How do you parse that all, and what's at stake in how this is all framed?
Well, I don't know, just from my perspective, and I think we disagree a little bit on this. You know, there seems to be a lot of different things going on at once. And one of them is that there are a lot of high-profile attacks that are caught on video now. And it's hard to make sense of what happens when things are caught on video in a short period of time, and that there's a type of propulsion that happens when those, in a narrative that sets in. And since the videos are so upsetting, people are really clamoring for an explanation. And when it's paired with what Trump was saying, and, I think that there's no question that more people in their everyday lives, or somebody in their family, somebody they know, has probably encountered somebody saying something to them, right? Or even attacking them. And that I think that that has led to a real sort of fear amongst a lot of people. It's difficult to say, hey, this is what the data says. It's also difficult to say in the other way, some of this bad data should be strung together to create this massive narrative that hate crimes against Asians are up 6,000% or something like that, right? Because a lot of the things that are collected as quote hate crimes are just people saying stuff on the street, or even walking across the street, or avoiding people on the subway or something like that, which, none of which qualifies as actual hate crime. I mean, even if it is racist and despicable. And so, it's hard to take all those types of things together and force them all into one idea. But it does seem like that's what's happening in a lot of ways. And with what happened in Georgia, it complicates everything even further, because, this is a horrific act during a time when people are already scared. It's you don't want to tell people that what they're thinking is wrong, because you also have no idea, so it's been a very confusing month or so, or a couple months.
Tammy?
I'm not sure I have too much to add. I think, as Jay was saying, there's the question of whether there's actually existentially a connection between all this stuff, or in reality, some sort of proven connection between all this stuff. And then there's just the question of how do people feel, and how do people interpret these events. And I think on the latter count, for sure, people are kind of stringing all of this together and just feeling kind of overall sense of, I think, resentment and neglect. And we've obviously been concerned on our show about how the thinking is kind of taking a carceral turn, in response to a lot of these actions, and also perhaps a turn that could be potentially disastrous politically. So we're certainly worried about that. But I think also we've just wanted to respect people's feelings of kind of mourning and confusion.
Yeah, there's a lot going on. I'd say as far as the Trump thing goes, I felt this way strongly last year when this all began, that Trump and COVID and all that stuff, for those who pay close attention, they didn't start all of this, that there were kind of mounting anti-China sentiments in the United States for a while, predating Trump. And I think it's probably going to continue under Biden, and perhaps in softer forms. And so we don't want to get into, I think, a very tempting but simplistic narrative that Trump started this, right? And then we have to think about why have polls shown Americans on average have more negative feelings towards China over the last 10 years or so. And this raises interesting questions with regards to Atlanta. And I think, we've had a lot of discussions about the Atlanta attack, and I almost feel like we almost bracketed off from the other ones because it seems like it's obviously the most high profile and we kind of know the most about it, even though there's still a lot we don't know about it. But I think one interesting that has come up, at least for me, in my mind a lot, is that, let's say that anti-China sentiments are a big part of this, but the victims were not all Chinese. And then if you go back to the long list of incidents caught on tape, there are Burmese, there's Indonesian, there's Thai, right? So there's a lot of non-Chinese people who are caught up in, if we accept the narrative of an anti-Chinese moment in U.S. history. And that raises a lot of, I think, tough questions. We've talked about like within the Asian American community, have Chinese people stood there with other Asian Americans or other immigrant groups? I think there might be some skeletons in the closet that might come out if we raise those questions. And, one thing we talk a lot about on the show is the international context. And the interesting thing is in Asia, there's no Asian solidarity. Like a lot of people are mad at China right now, the Philippines, Korea, like India, right? So just the bottom line for me is like, I think a lot of us are just like, we don't know what's going on right now. And it's hard to come up with a slogan to encapsulate all of it.
What's at stake in how this is all framed, which is what, when I was sort of discussing your analysis with a friend, an Asian American friend, Jay, was sort of the question that was posed back to me. Why is it important to attempt to get it right, given how people are feeling?
Well, I mean, I don't know. I think there's a couple of reasons why it's important to get it right, but and I think that right now it's difficult, but I do think that, just like with what happened with Vincent Chin, which was like a very high profile murder that happened in the 80s, where a Chinese American auto worker was beaten to death and by two people who were mad about Japanese auto industry taking jobs, right? That was a pretense that they said they did it. And that sort of sparked a whole wave of Asian American identity creation, right? A friend of mine actually calls it now the Vincent Chin Industrial Complex. Right? Tons of papers, a very famous documentary, and it's sort of a linchpin of Asian American studies, right? That Third World Liberation Front, and then all the sort of history about Chinese Exclusion Act and stuff like that, which everybody I think has seen repeated over and over again, both in the media and on social media. Michael Eric Dyson actually just wrote a piece about it yesterday, I think, right? And recounting the same exact history, Vincent Chin. So if this is a moment in which that is going to happen, which I think it is, where, there's an identity formed and there is some sort of, we are all X, then I think it's important to get what is actually happening correct. But I also think it's important to try and make, respectful interventions on what X is going to be. I think that on our podcast and a lot of what I've been writing recently is just an attempt to not quite figure out exactly what's happening, because I think that's almost unknowable, but to at least sort of push people towards a different type of identity formation than what I see happening, which is, what scared people always do, especially if they don't have a great foothold in this country, which is call for law and order, creation of like a nationalistic type of identity without really thinking, well, is this really a long-term type of thing? Like what happens when these attacks don't happen as much anymore, or if they're not caught on tape? Like what do we go forward with outside of, for this period of time this happened? I don't know. For those reasons, I think it's like important to just, I don't state my opinion.
Never stop
this
posting.
Is what I think, right?
I mean, you pointed to a pretty serious problem in a piece you wrote for the New York Times before the Atlanta killings about the high profile street assaults, and you argued that a sort of high level discourse that was taking place in places like the New York Times around anti-Asian hate crimes was disconnected from something more complex happening on the ground, which is that many Asians were interpreting these attacks as Black people attacking Asian people, which taps into some tensions and conflicts with just really deep roots. And you write that these professionals, your colleagues, tasked with publicly addressing these issues, have found it too uncomfortable to do so, which you argue could lead to bigger problems. What's going on there, and why is the failure to address it head on dangerous?
Well, I think that the most comfortable response that one can give in our position, right, in our meeting, like, I don't know, somebody like me and Tammy, who is East Asian and works in the media and works generally in what we can just frankly say are liberal spaces, right, left of the political spectrum, easiest answer you can give is everything is white supremacy. This is white supremacy. These are white attackers. But, my thing was like here in the Bay Area where I live, and which is what before Atlanta was sort of the epicenter of all of these high profile attacks and a lot of the outcry, the attackers very oftentimes weren't white. And the way that was being interpreted by the mostly Chinese American community here, but, there are also other communities, Cambodian, Laotian, Vietnamese communities here, was that, this was an extension of what had happened in 2010, when there was a whole bunch of very high profile Black on Asian attacks, which included an elderly person being pushed onto the train tracks and killed. And so when people have that sort of localized memory and it's highly racialized, and then the national media and people who come in are saying, oh, it's white supremacy in this sort of way that's extremely abstract, I think that leads to sort of reactionary politics outside of it, right? Like where you just say these people are all lying, or their heads are in the sand, or they're just saying this type of thing to be polite, or they don't, and I don't know, you see all of it. You see like, oh, this person is just a sellout for like their, white liberal editors. And the problem with that is not that you can't just ignore that, because there is some element of truth to that, right? There is an element of truth that the easiest explanation is always going to be, at least in these spaces, is to sort of hope that it's a white perpetrator so that you can say the same things about white supremacy. And in the aftermath of Atlanta, and I would say that, I want to preface this by saying that of all the things, like it's one of the least important things, but I did think that it was very telling, is that there almost seemed to be like an exhale amongst a lot of the punditry and a lot of the media people that finally we can just drop all of our posts about white supremacy. Finally, we can talk about the Chinese Exclusion Act. Finally, we can talk about Vincent Chin. And then you see this explosion of all that everywhere. Whereas before, it's much more restrained and not really discussed. And I think that part of the reason was because people did not want to engage with like both the local story, the long other history, which is, includes the LA riots and includes Latasha Harlan's 15-year-old girl was shot in the back of the head by a Korean store owner.
Over a bottle of orange juice.
Right. The boycotts that were happening during that time. And even before that, long histories that need to be brought into the conversation, or else the conversation will be meaningless to a lot of the people who are experiencing this street violence. Because you can say all you want about like how white supremacy, X, Y, Z, doesn't really make sense to people who are, saying, well, how does this make sense, right? Like when the two highest profile attacks here, or I guess the three highest profile attacks here are all by, not white assailants. And I don't know, I just...
Here being the East Bay.
Yeah, and in San Francisco. I just think that needs to be at least addressed, and that's sort of where I was, that's why I wrote that piece.
Tammy, you and Jay have both written about the LA riots. During that riot, more than 2,000 Korean stores were looted or burned to the ground, and Korean men took to the roofs of those businesses with rifles and shot at looters. And as you mentioned, Jay, prior to the acquittal of the cops who viciously beat Rodney King, there was the Korean store owner who shot and killed 15-year-old Latasha Harlins over a bottle of orange juice. What role did Black Asian conflict and the way that race, class, nationality all intersected in South Central LA at the time play in those riots? And looking back now nearly 30 years later, what lessons, if any, does it offer? And to what extent do you see similar dynamics at play?
Yeah, so that the memory of the LA riots definitely still, to my mind, inflects Asian and Black dynamics. And I would add also the Latino community, which isn't often talked about in the context of the riots. But when you look at both the property damage and the physical damage to human beings that occurred, Latinos were a huge part of that.
And at who was arrested. Many Latinos were arrested.
And who were arrested and, who were brutalized by the police. And now also, if you go to South LA, I mean, it's predominantly Latino. And that's just, the sort of physical and human landscape of that area has also changed a lot. But I think also at that time there were the boycotts in New York, where there were Black Asian interactions that were very uncomfortable. And all of this is about sort of who had kind of this immigrant capital in Black neighborhoods that had sort of low barriers of entry, to sort of petit bourgeois, and the resentments that kind of fan out from that. And that to some extent still continues, right? Because there are new waves of immigrants. There are stores that are passed down. There are still a lot of interactions, especially I would say in lower income urban areas between, and now it might be more Southeast Asian immigrants in Black communities or Latino communities. So it's something I think that, as Jay was mentioning, when the attacks occurred in the Bay, I certainly thought a lot about the LA riots, and I think other people did too. And I think it's something that is still very difficult to talk about because we have a contested terrain in the kind of POC politics that we try to practice on the left, that we have a sort of imagined unity of people of color, and we can analyze things through this lens of white supremacy. And, and some of that is kind of mythical, but also a good myth to pursue in some sense, right? That there are these political coalitions that we kind of knew were somewhat whimsical, but we had sort of committed ourselves to some decades ago, and that are still occasionally useful in constructing a kind of politics that we want to live. But I think LA to me is a reminder of the fact that those tensions still exist, and a sort of challenge to also try to figure out ways of overcoming through organizing those tensions, and to still believe in some sort of unified project across race.
Well, I think a lot of this stuff gets perhaps the bigger meta questions about what is race and what racism, and what is the history of it. I assume the three of us from our conversations, we're not necessarily looking for Asian Americans to do some sort of soul searching into the anti-Blackness within Asian culture, although that's probably worth investigating, right? But I think for most, we would kind of think race and racism isn't about this kind of deep-seated thing that people just kind of carry with them in a sort of Fred Fragility style worldview. It's more that, if you look at the history of these places in the Americas, North America and the Americas, Asian and Black and Indigenous and Latin American and white people have lived amongst each other for centuries at this point. And the sort of familiar narrative of white-Black racism is simplistic and infantilizing, I think, for a lot of people. And maybe that's getting to what Jay is talking about in terms of the anger, the sort of sense of being lied to, that for a lot of us, it's not news, right? That you have not just top down or unidirectional racism, that it's complicated and multi-directional. And that comes out of perhaps what Tammy is talking about, right? These are about class distinctions. These are about occupational and geographic, specialization that gives birth to racism and racial stereotypes. And it's not just this sort of mentally, culturally deep thing that we have to have some soul-searching conversation about. It's we have to confront these things. The stuff is just kind of hiding there in plain sight. We can talk about it. It doesn't have to be this, national referendum on what's wrong with Asian culture.
Yeah, and I think the precarity that Tammy was talking about is interesting, right? That I think that a lot of times it's difficult for Asian Americans to discuss this stuff because they feel like they'll be booted out of the POC coalition. And the truth is that the vast majority of Asian Americans don't give a shit about being they don't give a shit about being part of a POC coalition. They really don't. I don't know many who do, who aren't within the academy, the media, professional ranks. So it's interesting because then you have two layers of message, and the first layer of message is let's just talk about 92, right? In Los Angeles. And you have people who are just why did this happen? Why are they only burning down our stores, right? And then, of course, you have a protective reactionary politics that come out of it. And then you have a reaction that is coming from, people who are mostly in the academy at the time, or activists or organizers who are organizing summits, for example, right? After all this happened, and marches and conversations and panels. Those two conversations have no overlap with one another. And, the people who are having the solidarity conversations, the people who are having the conversations about, many of them are organizers who are working within the community. So there is that, right? And those people, I think, should be lauded. It's the type of work that we would like to do. But the sort of messaging that goes out is completely divorced from the actual reality of how a lot of these Korean immigrants feel. And it feels like it felt then, and it feels now, to me at least, as a sort of wallpapering over, right? Like how do we sort of reject the ugly parts of our immigrant past so that we can sort of evolve into POC coalition? But then also there's a way to interpret that and say, well, how do we sort of absolve ourselves of all of the ugly immigrant stuff so that we can basically just become white liberals, right? And I think there's a lot of that going on right now as well. Like Andy said, Ivy League students in a very sort of high profile way during the summer were writing letters home to their parents, and they would publish the letters to their parents. And, they're like, and there's this sort of shame and deference in, the letters are about like anti-Blackness in their communities. And in some ways, that's a great project. And in other ways, it's just like, well, why are you doing this? Like, what are you ashamed of? What are you trying to purge from your own self? And what do you want to be after the purge is over? And it almost feels like they're trying to disassociate themselves from like the bad type of immigrants, and that they're trying to sort of evolve into this, like pure progressive person who does not actually think of themselves as an oppressed person, but only is concerned about other oppressed persons, which in effect is like a white liberal.
Yeah, there was a lot of talk last summer about how to combat the necessity to combat anti-Black racism in Latino and Asian communities, but not so much of a discussion about what sort of politics would bring Asians and Latinos into a left coalition and keep them from turning rightward. Does this entire approach miss something about how to actually combat racism, that building a majority coalition behind a politics that is anti-racist involves something beyond telling people not to be racist or reminding them that Republicans are racist, or to tell them to tell their grandmothers that they're racist or whatever?
I mean, yeah, this is a question I've been thinking of is anti-white supremacy like a basis for organization versus shared material interests, right? And I think the thing that pushes, let's say, conservative or on the fence Asian Americans and Asian American immigrants left is not necessarily banding together against white supremacy. It's things like education and healthcare and things that they think will help them move up. And you can say like upward mobility is a conservative issue, but it's also like a leftward one. Like it could be framed in a way that is appealing to people in terms of getting them to buy into some sort of universalist program of social welfare and so on. But I mean, Tammy, I'd be curious what you think. Like, does anti-white supremacy, does it mobilize people, or does it just kind of get people to like, share blog posts about their experiences?
I think it's pretty hard to mobilize around that because it is so abstract. And also, if you're talking about actually organizing working class people, like what does that mean? I think that most of our articulations of it are so sort of academic. I was thinking, though, about that the 2020 election really, I think, gives us our answer that white supremacy isn't really anti-white supremacy isn't an organizing principle, in fact, right? Because all of the POC numbers went up for Trump. So just even at the presidential level, I think we can say that, we had the most sort of obviously outwardly, like ostentatiously racist president. And yet that didn't serve as a kind of ground for some sort of, POC unity. Yeah, I mean, I think all four of us would agree that we need, universal public goods and some sort of discourse around a basic fundamental way to thrive and to flourish in this country as a way to talk to especially new immigrants about what it is they should want. And I think if you look at kind of democratic or kind of liberal left, street organizing, grassroots organizing of, say, like new immigrant East Asians and new immigrant Latinos, like it takes a lot of work to convince those folks to vote a particular way, and they have to know why they're doing that. And I think organizers do that, and they are like, this is a pro-immigrant platform, right? Or this is a platform that's good, like you're on Medicaid, this is what you should want. And so I think making those our goals instead, and then eventually bringing those groups together through the organizing networks is really the only way there's actually like a strategic unity for these people. I think otherwise there'll just be a lot of miscommunication around what this kind of theoretical goal of fighting racism is.
Right. And if you look at the polling, right, in both the Latino and the Asian communities, when they prioritize what they care about, it's education, healthcare, like anti-racism stuff is like fourth, right? Immigration broadly is not even that high up. And so it has, one of the frustrations that I had personally with the messaging around Biden the Biden campaign was that it just seemed to be like, hey, if we say we're not racist, then everyone, all the race people, are gonna be like, oh yeah, cool, you have my vote.
Yeah,
There's
totally.
like this almost like taking for granted that if you stand up and you say Black Lives Matter, if you paint it on a street, then like it's not just all the black people now are happy with you. It's like all the other people are happy with you too.
Yeah.
And that certainly isn't true on any level, like for any of those groups. And that sort of broad anti-racist politics, like it just like it falls apart the second, like you don't have to do that much. Just walk into like a Chinese restaurant in like a major city in like the Chinatown and just be like, yeah, like, like these people don't give a shit about any of this stuff, like how could they,
Yeah.
So that's the sort of frustration with it. I think that the three of us have, that we talk about quite a bit, is just like, how, you have to talk to these people at some level without patronizing them. And I really do think that the way in which that broad language takes hold, it's meaningless to them. And that doesn't mean that you should abandon it, right? But that you need a specific way to talk to these people.
And yet people believe that this incantation that Trump is racist, the Democrats are not racist. They believed that it was so innately powerful. Why, more specifically, did it not resonate on the ground in the way that people just sort of presumed that it would? And what does that gap reveal?
Well, we talked a lot about Kamala, right? And how Kamala was suddenly like the first Asian American vice presidential candidate once she became the nominee. But in the primaries, this was a little bit more ambiguous, right? So just one data point would be something like they might not have thought too much about these categories, right? And then they thought by picking Kamala, that they would get the Chinese vote and the Korean vote in a way that seems a little bit out of touch, right? With like that way that people think about identity at a basic level. I think, I think the campaign for Kamala was a lot about, identity and identifying with her in a way that maybe was successful with Obama in previous campaigns. And I think I don't know. I mean, they won the election, so I guess we can't say it was a failure, but we didn't see nearly the same, I think, identity-based swings as before.
I mean, not only did more Asian Americans vote for Trump in 2020 than in 2016, but in some places and in some communities, the shift was just enormous, like Vietnamese Americans in Orange County, California, just like, so, and there was this whole, ahead of the 2020 election, there were loads of articles. You can see them like published just like weeks ahead of the 2020 elections about how Asian Americans had once been conservative leaning, but in recent years have been shifting decisively leftward, like weeks ahead of November 2020. And then that all gets scrambled. What's the chronology here? Why were Asian Americans voting so solidly Republican? And then what accounts for this shift leftward that seemed like it was kind of permanent in some ways? And then what the hell happened?
It's a lot to do with immigration patterns, and it has to do with who the voters are. At the beginning, it's a ton of Reaganite Asian Americans who came here and they believe in the American dream, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of them come from over here on skilled worker visas, and so they've already entered the middle class a few years into coming to the United States, and so they have middle class interests. But the question of why there's a swing is, it's very complicated. It has everything to do with like, it's triggered by everything from like geography, like where did you end up? So, some of the explanation of why in Orange County there's a big rightward swing amongst the Asian communities because they're around a bunch of conservative people, So it makes sense that like you take on the politics of the people that you're around. Now, there are other reasons, obviously like anti-communism, et cetera, but, that's a big part of it. And it doesn't really swing until I think like 92 or so, dramatically. And then you start to see a swing. And then by the time that it's, Hillary Clinton, it's a huge population. And that's because a lot of the people who vote tend to be the kids of the people who immigrated here in the 70s and 80s. And those people a lot of times are educated in liberal environments, and they leave college, and just like the three of us, they have very left-leaning politics or progressive politics or just straight line centrist Democrat politics. But and I guess in that way, the sort of anti-racism stuff does make sense, right? Because I think it does take kids who think of themselves as minorities in America, but also American, and makes them hypersensitive to racism, right? And so they pick the less racist party. But now there are other immigrants coming on at the same time, right? So it's not just one continuum. There are more populations coming in, and they have different politics. And so it's all just a big scramble, but and it's very hard to like create one narrative out of, just because it's so many different things going on at once.
And I also think it's not until recently that any politician has to take Asian America seriously as a voting bloc. Like, it wasn't that big of a population. Like, it has been marked as a fast growing population, however the grouping is, for some years now. But, I think it's still a fairly recent phenomenon where we can actually exercise some political muscle as a contingent.
Yeah, and just to add to that, when politicians speak to Asian Americans, they're probably speaking, as Jay said, to people like us, right? Who they actually encounter in the DC world, the New York world, of like politically active people. But if we disaggregate, I think you have to disaggregate. You can't talk about Asian Americans in any meaningful sense once you break it down into like who's a second generation, who's first generation, and what part of the world do they come from. I can say anecdotally, like Taiwanese immigrants were very overwhelmingly GOP for reasons to do with geopolitics and the world that they came from growing up in the 60s and 70s, where the GOP was the party defending Taiwan. I don't know if that's the case with South Korea. And anti-communism has been thrown out there, but like a lot of, I think, Chinese immigrants from the PRC, which is, ostensibly a communist country, have kind of right-leaning politics as well, for reasons that are also specific to the Chinese experience. And so I think one thing we've kind of talked a lot about on the show is you can't just assume people show up show up to the United States as a blank slate, right? They bring with them the histories of the countries they come from and the values and the ideas and so forth. And Asian American kind of conceals as a category, Asian American conceals a lot of that. So it'd be useful to kind of think about these things as networks or as international processes as well.
And there are also voters that have zero outreach from either party. So that's one of the things that's interesting in a lot of the data that's been collected, that, like a lot of it is inconclusive and it's hard to, but the one thing that's very clear is that in every single election for the past 20 years, like the gap between every other community having reached out to in some way by politicians, people running for office, and Asians it's like a huge gap. And so, at that point, there's almost no interaction with any sort of machine politics or anything like that. And so then you have a community that's just sort of, like they're not directed in any sort of way, or communities that aren't directed in any sort of way.
One thing we should cover before we get any further is just like what to make of the term Asian American. Jay, you've written, quote, "Asian American is a mostly meaningless term. Nobody grows up speaking Asian American. Nobody sits down to Asian American food with their Asian American parents, and nobody goes on pilgrimages back to their motherland of Asian America." To what extent does Asian America exist? Do Asian Americans exist? And to what extent does its existence happen in response to things like what have happened recently, what happened to Vincent Chin in Detroit in 1982, to what's happening with these conflicts over prestigious high school and university admissions?
Yeah, I think it's a very convenient term that's leveraged politically that in these types of moments. And I'm not saying it's done cynically. I just think it's done because like people are confused. And, the one thing that we can say is that like if me and Andy stand next to each other and somebody racist comes up and they want to punch a Chinese person, it's like kind of 50-50 which one they're going to choose, Like I don't have an advantage because I'm not Chinese. Just punch one of us, So that is a reality, right? But I don't think that, it's not sort of the political history of that term. It is just sort of a truth. And I think that for people who were here before, that it might have meant something more, like people who might have been fifth generation or people who were interned, Japanese Americans who were interned. I think that there might have been like more coherence because there's so few people, right? And they tended to live in similar cities. But even then, it's not like the Chinese Americans were interned either. So it's not like they were receiving the same sort of treatment. And so, yeah, just cards on table, like I don't think that it's a particularly useful term. I would argue that we should just disaggregate into countries of origin, maybe not even that. I think that people should identify more as immigrants, because I think that that sort of, is a universal experience that all people from Asia probably have, is some sort of history of immigration. And that's why I'm so resistant to the creation of an Asian American identity out of this type of moment, because I just don't know. I don't see any way that it would go that would reflect my politics or what I think would actually help the people who are, now Asian American, I guess. It is a conversation I've never really understood. And yet we do like a Asian American podcast.
So there you are. Yeah, Tammy, do you agree with Jay? Because the term emerged out of kind of among left-wing student activists in late 1960s California, this sort of third worldist political milieu that at least wanted something different out of the term and the identity than the reality that Jay's critiquing.
I feel differently than Jay. I think in place of his mostly meaning is that I would say it's a synthetic term that is still useful and like affectively like is very powerful and that I've lived and enjoyed. Like in college, that was my world, like Asian America. Like we did Asian American things. Like all of my friends were Asian American and they're still like some of my closest people. And it isn't an accident, as Jay was just joking, that like Jay and Andy and I have a lot of stuff in common. Like we have different backgrounds and different migration histories, and we speak different natal languages, and yet there's something. And so I think there are certainly dangers in kind of reacting to violence by forming certain sorts of political coalitions that may or may not be, always sanguine. I think there are like different ways they can go terribly awry. And yet I would say that emotionally, culturally, like spiritually, there is like a there that I have enjoyed and continue to enjoy in certain spaces.
Andy?
Yeah, I don't have too much to add to that. I think both have fair points. I was just thinking the other day that in writing or in language, we kind of stopped saying like whites and blacks, or it's like white people, black people. But we still say Asians all the time. But I feel like Asian Americans say it to each other as a shorthand, and it's acceptable. And I was thinking, like, what's up with that? It's sort of this inside language we have when we talk to each other and say, there's like, when Asians do this, right? But
just because it's too long to type out the other part of it.
But it's 2 syllables instead of 1. But I might feel differently, Dan, if you said it. So I don't know. I feel like there might be still sort of like an inside-outside sort of thing where, it's like, as long as you can talk about Asians to other Asians, there is a sort of shared experience. I think a lot of it, honestly, we talk about this on the show a lot, is like consumption. Like we all eat the same foods and we share these foods.
But we don't, though.
Close enough.
To respond to you earlier, I don't disagree with Tammy that there's some sort of connection that, you sort of hang out together, you go to boba shops together. But
I assumed you were referring to boba.
I assumed
you were referring to boba, Andy.
The thing that I was sort of responding to when I wrote that was the idea that the third worldist sort of late 60s and then through that extension the Asian American studies and the academy has sort of put out there that this one moment in the late 60s that happened at San Francisco State and at Cal Berkeley, that student activists created like a multiracial coalition and that Asian American as a term was created, and that term was always going to be radical in its politics, right? That it was going to spawn like several Maoist organizations, that it was going to always stand in solidarity and do like yellow peril stands with Black Power, that it was going to be internationalist as well. I think all that stuff is awesome, but it has no relevance to the lives of most people. You learn about it in college, maybe. I didn't, but I learned about it after college, but, highly educated person who would be in contact with those types of ideas. And so for my sense, like what I was talking about is like, if that is constantly harped upon as being like, that this is what it is, this is what it is, this is what it is, right? And that idea doesn't make sense to 99% of the people who you're saying, this is who you are, this is who you are, this is who you are, then the term is meaningless, right? And that those people can scream at me all they want, which they have, the third world is. They get as bad at me as they want, but like, come on, it was, I am accused many times of being very glib about history, but, I find that to be I think that's sort of a rotten accusation. But, I've gone back, I've read all the documentation of that time, all the primary sources. And even then there was conflict within those groups about whether or not this was just, whether or not this was too abstract, right? And then you had kids writing in letters to like Gidra or any of the places that were the sort of main publishing houses for this type of thought, being like what you guys are saying doesn't make sense to me. I just want to be like a American guy. Like, I'm sorry, I just want to like move to the suburbs and have a house and have kids. And so even in 1967, right, before, when Asian Americans were much more scarce than they are now, there was conflict over that. And so this creation of this sort of huge history out of that moment is what I was responding to. I don't, I just don't believe in it as a political term in that way.
Sorry, just one last thing. In that moment in the 60s, I just came across the other day, of people in America who were Asian, 40% were born in the United States, were born outside the United States. And now today, those who identify as Asian, 80% were born out of the United States. So I think one thing that's happened since that 60s moment when Asian American as a category was born is that Asian Americans became more Asian, right, and less American. And I think that's something that, it might be something that's kind of, you're running a theme that kind of runs throughout a lot of the stuff we talk about, the contrast between the 60s and the present, and the need to think about, that would force you to think about like what does it mean to actually be Chinese American versus Korean American versus Vietnamese, which maybe in the 60s they thought that was going to die, that was going to fade away. And because as people kind of became more American and more, domestic centered, then those differences would matter less.
Right. So like those if you were a third generation person Chinese American who was from Salinas, California, and you grew up in like an agricultural society, then of course, and you thought of yourselves entirely as American, then of course you had ideas of solidarity with like with the people who were in Salinas with you, right? Which was a lot of different people of different races. But, what happens right before 1967, 1968, when Third World Liberation happens is that the 1965 Immigration Act passes, and a whole, it's almost like there's two Asian Americas, right? There's pre-1965 and post-1965. And the three of us are post-1965. I would imagine almost every Asian American that anybody listening to this show knows is post-1965, right? Like, that means that all those people come in, they have no context. If my mother if I asked her what Third World Liberation Front is, despite her reading my writing, she would have no idea what the Third World Liberation Front is, right? And so for us, the children of those immigrants who do identify as American, then, like, it's a little bit harder to expect all those people to have the same sort of deep-rooted ideas about being American, especially when, as Andy said, 80% of them weren't even born here. I wasn't born in the United States either. So maybe next generation is when the third world stuff will come back. Although I see it coming back with, I'm 41, so I see it coming back with like 19, 20-year-olds, and maybe that's the timeline.
Yeah, Jay, you mentioned that people seem eager to be able to invoke the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act as though history informs American racism in some sort of self-explanatory way. Though obviously it powerfully shapes every moment of American history, but it's certainly not always self-explanatory. It's a bit more obviously explanatory for, say, Black Americans, where you can draw, who are descendants of slaves, you can draw a direct line from slavery to the defeat of Reconstruction, to the Great Migration, to segregation and ghettoization, to where we are today. And you can learn a lot just from connecting those dots. But as you say, with Asian Americans, I think there's a much sharper break between pre and post 1965 immigration. And just to give context for listeners, between the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act to the 1917 Asian Barred Zone, which restricted or excluded pretty much everyone from Asia from entry, minus Filipinos because they were U.S. colonial subjects, there's just a huge break that takes place. And so it's an incredibly heterogeneous experience, not just in terms of all the countries people are coming from, but in terms of when they come here. My upstairs neighbor and good friend Mia Inoue, a political theorist, is a fourth generation Japanese American who her family arrived in the U.S. to work in plantations in Hawaii, was interned in Utah, and then became leading figures in the Mormon community there. And that's just like an entirely different experience than those that you've grown up with.
Right. They can draw the lines, right, if you've been there that long. And so few people are because, the line is like nobody could come in, so then it's like, well, if no one can come in, then it's, by definition, a small group. And I don't know, that sort of history is, like you said, Dan, I don't know if it is meaningful except in outlining a attitude towards Asian Americans throughout American history. And in that way, I think you can say, yeah, right. But it is not a lived history for the majority of people who are here. It is not a direct lineage that they can draw back in the same way that Black Americans can. Also, I think in a lot of ways, a lot of, it's not the groups that are recent immigrants now, like that history, I don't know, it feels like it is a project that is not entirely about them, right? It is about white people. It's not about the actual immigrants themselves. Like it's about what white people do. And that way I don't think it's particularly useful.
But I think there's a way in which you don't have to know that specific history and the literal facts of that history to still feel like Asian American is a thing, not just affectively and emotionally, but also politically or socially or as a policy matter. Totally anecdotally, like my mom migrated here not on a skilled visa, and the people she encountered and was very close to in her early days of migration were all like new Asian immigrants of various kinds. And, I think she did feel like there was something about their Asianness, their new experience in the US. And perhaps it would have been true for any new immigrant, if they had new African immigrants or new Latin American immigrants who they were with, that would have been the case too. But I know for her in her adult life, that has been important. But she doesn't know that history of like Gidra and the Berkeley moment. And yet I think she would say there is a kind of thing that is Asian American.
Yeah, I think the fear is we go too determinist and say like, well, you don't change. You don't change after you come here. My wife is actually like fourth generation Hawaiian Japanese as well.
Right, that's right.
Her family and me, like, we just look alike, and there's a lot of like feeling out. Like we don't speak the same languages. But, there's still like...
It's familiar.
Yeah, we all like Jeremy Lin, like, it's a thing.
Low bar, Andy.
It's like, it's different, obviously, than if she were, born in the 80s. Or if her family came over in the 80s like mine did. But, it's like, once we grow up, we choose who we hang out with and who we talk to and all that stuff. And that there's still a chance to create something out of that, yeah.
The last thing I'll say about this is that my critique is not on an interpersonal level. People can feel whatever they want. My sense is really just that I do think that there is a way in which this Asian American identity is totally class bound, right? And it is always representative of an upwardly mobile population. And, there's a reason why I think after these shootings, there's this effort to make this big history so that everybody who's Asian American can feel part of it. And then there's, people going on about, well, I'm so sad that I took an Americanized name, right? It's talking about microaggressions and things like that. I think that that's harmful. Like, I think that when the actual conditions of the women who were killed in this attack are ignored, right? And that everything just becomes, Asian America, Asian America, Asian America. And you've basically erased everything that put them in a vulnerable position in the first place, right? And then it does just become, well, 1867, this happened, the Chinese Exclusion Act happened. 1967, we rose up with like the Panthers and AAPA and part of the Third World Liberation Front. Just like, what are you doing here? Are you just trying to create identity that you as an upwardly mobile Asian American person, like me, I am also part of this population, can fully inhabit these spaces without actually thinking about the material and actually much more important differences between you and those other people who are actually more vulnerable. And, that's the part where I find that identity to be not toxic, but just to be like a problem for me personally. But yeah, people can play League of Legends and hang out if they want. I mean, I do that too. So, I just don't think the identity part is interesting.
That could be true even with...
That's why you have that nice headset.
That could be true even within Korean, Jay, like or Chinese, right? So
Of
it's
course,
not, so
yeah,
that's
yeah.
that doesn't solve it either necessarily.
Yeah, to what extent is this? To what extent is the critique that this is an identity category that doesn't match people's lived experience, and to what degree is this a problem of any imagined community
That's not classed, right?
that's not classed?
Right. Yeah. I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean. Yeah. I mean, these might be two separate things, right? Where
Like, because what's nation state identity? What's national identity? Like,
or like what
how
is
does it
Black and
function under
Latino?
capitalism? It's to tell you that you have more in common with a rich person
Right,
from
right,
your
right.
country than you do
Right.
a
Yeah.
working class person from another country.
Yeah.
But let's talk
sure.
about a more capacious, but more recently coming into crisis concept, that of people of color, which, Jay, you unsurprisingly have written, just like Asian Americans, does not correspond to people's lived reality in any meaningful way. But Tammy, you also unsurprisingly, and I love that you have a podcast where you disagree. It makes it fun to listen to. You've written about the value of the term POC, people of color, particularly in contrast to the neologism BIPOC, which has kind of appeared, as far as my 38-year-old leftist self can process it, kind of like out of nowhere, but becomes suddenly extremely de rigueur in the last year or so. And Tammy, you wrote, quote, "This was how the term came to me and came to structure much of the US-based activism I've been involved with since the late 1990s. In student organizing as well as immigrant rights work, housing campaigns, and the labor movement, people of color and the more revolutionary women of color helped define a united front against those in power, who were almost invariably white and male, whether boss or landlord, provost or governor. Rejecting the term people of color may be of little consequence, but rejecting the solidarity it implies can result in an inaccurate and unduly limiting worldview." How does this floating signifier of people of color operate right now? Why is it suddenly in a state of a bit of a crisis? And what do you make of the term BIPOC that many people want to see replace and supplant people of color, and where Asian Americans fit or really kind of don't entirely fit within it?
I think we Asian Americans don't know if we're included under either of those categories. And maybe, as Jay was saying, we don't care. But I think also a lot of people who are people of color who aren't us don't care whether we're in there or not now. I think BIPOC is a product of our Black Lives Matter moment, which is like a really positive thing that I've supported. But I think one of the drawbacks of that term in particular is that in trying to highlight like Black, Indigenous, people of color, or Black, Indigenous, and people of color, depending on who you talk to about what BIPOC means, there's potentially a sort of, I don't know, kind of like an exclusionary logic or some sort of like hierarchical logic that's, in that term. And I think it leads to kind of weird things on the ground. Like, I've been to a lot of protests over the past couple of years where, it's the sort of thing of like, if you're white, you need to go over to this side and you can't talk. Or, we want to have this particular group of people talk first and be in this position. And some of that stuff I just find really weird as someone who really cares about organizing and has been involved in it and really believes in the interpersonal and the extremely like long-term relationship building that has to undergird, solidarity struggles. So yeah, I guess I just worry about that and kind of like what it does to us and what it does to the way that we need to see the world. And of course, like people of color I'll just continue going with my term of like synthetic, like, and all of this stuff is just provisional and contingent and like sort of situational. And yet at the same time, I think it can be very, very useful in doing politics. That said, I think I would also, if I'm doing some sort of like union campaign and very, aware of the fact that whatever the majority of workers in this particular workplace are white, and I want to have a really inclusive meeting, like, I think we would also think about like what role does acknowledging the particular struggles of people of color play in that particular meeting. Like all of this stuff to me is like they're organizing questions about like when we deploy certain words and like what we want them to do. I think there is something still to me that is like real about like what like people of color, like what non-white people share and like how that can help us analyze the world of power.
Andy, Jay?
personally, like, I go to these jobs and there's always like a room in the Slack, that's like for non-white people of color. I love that stuff.
I've never been in one.
Yeah, I was in one at one place in particular that was great, but so I don't doubt these connections exist, right? Or that there is some shared experience. I just think that the term itself at this point is under such, like, it's so hotly contested, right? And who is in, who's out, like who counts, who doesn't count?
Yeah.
What are you talking about? When is it employed? And so like, yes, it is used when a corporate Slack needs a space for people to talk, it is used when, I would say, especially by Asian Americans, it's used when it is convenient to think of oneself as a person of color. And I am not saying that all the invocations are cynical, but it does seem to be like, if somebody has some sort of complaint or something happens, or then they say, oh, well, people of color, or if they want more diversity at a place and they say people of color. I'm not sure if I think that type of politics is necessarily productive at this point, or if it leads to just more fights about what the term actually means and who's included. So, in schooling, you have these, now you have categories where it's like white and Asian versus people of color, right? And then it's like, all right, so what does this term mean? Does it just mean when certain races are on the short side of the ledger? And I also think it has a mystifying effect because it's so confusing. Like, I just don't think that people really understand or grasp it anymore. And so my general sense is that, like, I don't think it's a useless term in the way that I think Asian American is a useless term. But I do think that it is a term that it is not particularly, it has so little clarity now. And it seems like most of the conversations about it are just meta debates about what it means.
As much as this podcast is dedicated to owning the libs, can we get out of either Asian American or people of color as long as racism makes race that the way that it does? And not to invoke history without context, but I'm reading a great book, this history by Rick Baldoz, called The Third Asiatic Invasion, about U.S. empire in the Philippines and anti-Filipino nativism at home, and like the very revealing interconnections and contradictions between the two things. And it's called The Third Asiatic Invasion. And it's called The Third Asiatic Invasion because that's what people were calling the arrival of Filipinos, because the first one was Chinese and the second one was Japanese. So there is one continuity I think we can draw pre and post 1965 is white Americans and probably other just non-Asian Americans in general homogenizing Asians. So it's almost like, how can Asian Americans, and look, we keep using the term Asian Americans even as we critique it, how do you escape a category that racism and the way that racism operates in American political economy is so conducive to creating? It's kind of how racism always makes race, in a sense, right?
There's some interesting stuff that's coming out, I think, within Asian American studies and Asian studies that I think is making this claim that, racism, like specifically, for instance, United States racism against Asian immigrants starting in the 19th century, looked different than the racism you would see against, enslaved and emancipated Black people, right? And that those kinds of differences are grounded in political economy, and that a liberal worldview would not be able to see that, right? It's just about, same and other and difference and all that stuff. An approach that's more attenuated to political economy would be able to draw those distinctions. And I think that would, to go back to like the very beginning of this interview, talking about why are people upset at China these days, right? I think a lot of it is grounded in political economy, right? People know that the economy in the United States has not been doing well for decades. They see all the stuff that used to be made in the United States is made in China these days. And that is, I think, the basis for a lot of the friction that's out there. And so the racism against Chinese people is a racism, but it's different than the racism. It's related, but still distinct from the racism or the stereotypes you would see against people from Latin America, against Black, against Muslim, against other groups, right? And so I think as an academic, I think those approaches are much more useful for understanding racism and race. And you're right that we shouldn't get trapped in the language of race to combat race. I think that is kind of the folly that might maybe, like, Jay and Tammy are talking about with POC and Asian American, that we don't want to take these things for real and reify them too much as if like that is the basis for our identity. It might be strategically useful once in a while, but we want to think about the world, think politically along different lines than just race, right? Because then you get trapped and you can't escape it.
But what's interesting is so if you apply the term working poor and working class before Asian American or POC, you automatically get like a way more useful category. And I think a lot of the stuff we've been talking about obviously is kind of how our language to describe ourselves is class differentiated. But if we really specify, that if we say working class POC, suddenly like what Black people, Latinos, Indigenous people, Asian people are facing in the US actually looks quite similar. And you can kind of articulate the goals of that coalition. I'll put coalition in quotes because it needs to be created. But yeah, I think that just points to the fact that obviously we need to always have a class analysis over these race categories.
No, a lot of the confusion about Asian Americans' position in the American racial hierarchy, I think, relates to Asians' incredibly diverse class positions and how those class positions are then rendered racially and culturally in the American imaginary, because Asian Americans have the highest median household income in the U.S., significantly higher than whites, but they're also the most unequal ethnic group in terms of income. And in New York City, at least a few years back, Asian Americans were the poorest immigrant group. How do you see the really various and contradictory ways that Asian Americans fit into American political economy affect how Asian Americans are racialized?
Yeah, I mean, the argument that I'll just throw out the book that's kind of on my mind is Aiko Day, who's written a book called Alien Capital, has made this argument that on the one hand, Asian Americans are kind of racialized the same way that Jewish people were, right? That they embody the sort of abstract global capital that people, especially like working middle class people, find really invasive, and that they should be targeted for that reason. But also,
also small businessmen in Black ghettos.
Yeah, right. Like they represent capital; they don't represent labor. On the other hand, if you go back to like yellow peril discourses from the 19th to 20th century, and that might be in this book you're referring to, Dan, even Chinese workers were seen as not just workers, but as basically robots who were operating for white capital, right? If you look at the illustrations and caricatures of white people upset about Chinese railroad workers, right? They said it was unfair because these Chinese people are unfree coolies and prostitutes who are at the service of these white capitalists. And so in both cases, either Chinese merchants and capitalists or Chinese or Asian workers were kind of seen as embodying the sort of dehumanizing logic of global capitalism, right? And it's a really interesting thesis. I haven't thought too hard about it empirically or historically, but I think it does get at this point that like the fact that also we come from another country, we come across this gigantic ocean, right? There is a sense that Asian Americans are this kind of unimaginable global thing that invades.
Horde.
Right. Yeah. As opposed to saying, other stereotypes would be like other groups are subordinate and they're getting uppity and they are, not staying in their place, right? Whereas Asian Americans are coming from the other direction, right? They're the ones who are ruining everything. They're this invisible force that I think that's especially true. A posit with obviously the rise of China as an economic force, and then COVID like kind of intensified it, right? This literally invisible virus that has kind of ruined this country that came from China. So yeah.
Though now there's a contrast with the 19th century in that sense, because Chinese workers in the 19th century were seen as so innately, biologically and culturally or whatever, servile that they were incapable of standing up to capital and incapable of fulfilling the ideals of free labor, and thus, that were perceived to be the bedrock of a free people and a democracy. So all of that was connected there. And now I'm not sure. I don't know if the servility is, well, no, I think it does. I think it's still played out, for example, in the coverage of the sort of justificatory coverage of why Asian countries have done better than the U.S. in managing the pandemic.
Confucianism.
Nick Kristof.
Yeah, they'll just follow all those. Yeah, they'll follow rules, and that might be cool for them. But do you really want to do that, Americans? Is that who we are? No, thank you.
It's good to bring in this to talk about what exactly you're talking about. That Asian Americans have these crazy statistics in terms of their income levels, and like we have to be honest about like who is speaking for Asian Americans and what does that mean? It's not this liberal sense of, it's not just this liberal category of we're a different group. It's like we're also a group that seems to be thriving economically in some parts of this country, and obviously many Asian Americans are not. and there's a huge income gap, and there's a huge question of like who gets to speak for other Asian Americans, and what is the everyday experience for other Americans to perceive Asian Americans? That I think that's good to complicate the discussion.
Right. If as long as the conversation is dominated by this sort of upwardly mobile group that I've referred to before, then I do think it is. I think that's also part of the reason why it's hard to imagine oneself or for other groups to imagine that those people are within some sort of POC coalition or any type of coalition at all, right? Because you're just like, well, you're fine, you went to X school and you make X amount of money. I don't know. I've always thought, not always thought, but recently I've thought like, well, like I don't mean to be like a nihilist here and say, oh, every term sucks, And so I do think that my thought has always just been that if Asian American is an identity, then it should be centered around the concerns of working class Asian Americans, and that it requires for, people like me, Tammy, and Andy to sort of like give up our own neurosis about belonging in the upper middle class or something like that. And to really just sort of engage and indulge in real work with coalition building. And I do think that if you create something like that, then the natural solidarity with Latino groups, at the very least, right, becomes much more obvious. Because you can tell a story about how we need services. We're all immigrants, right? Like we work, we're workers. Like that sort of conversation, I think, is much more conducive. And I also think that within Asian Americans that it would actually be more attractive. Like, because, I will say I sense this fatigue, and maybe this is just me, projecting out to everyone. I just like nobody likes this version of the identity that exists right now. Nobody wants it to be about crazy rich Asians and Hollywood representation, and like the bamboo ceiling and CEO and like the last thing is more serious in terms of like actual career advancement. But the first two, where everyone's like, oh well, now like this Marvel movie existed and there are no Asians in it. And they've whitewashed us again. Like, nobody wants that. Nobody really wants their political identity to be those types of questions, right? So, I don't know. My hope has been to that, like, maybe we can, I just do it by, like, mercilessly trolling the people who do that, which is not a productive way to do it. But there must be some sort of alternative out there that is more rooted in the concerns of, like, working class immigrants.
Speaking of the bamboo ceilings, I want to get a little more into how educational politics are remaking Asian American politics, because like, what does it mean that this collective identity of Asian American is so often taken on in response to shared adversity, when in some cases the adversities that Asian Americans feel that they collectively face don't sit at all well with left politics? For example, Asian American opposition to efforts to diversify elite public high schools like Bronx Science in New York by de-emphasizing standardized tests and admissions, opposition to university affirmative action programs and admission practices that some activists charge discriminate against Asians. How did these controversies emerge, and how are they playing out among Asian Americans socially and politically?
Jay's the one who's written more about this. The one thing I will say, though, is looking at the numbers, there's the numbers that suggest Asian American support for affirmative action has fallen over the last decade. But if you disaggregate it, it's almost entirely Chinese immigrants who have a negative view. Everyone else, probably because we're all liberalized, become liberals in our bubbles, more or less support it to the same degree, I think, as they did 10 years ago. So it's actually probably has to be kind of further specified as first generation, second generation Chinese immigrants. That's my impression, but I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know how much those polls matter, because like once you change the wording in a few of those, like the results are totally different, right? Like it's like if you do support affirmative action has a high yes rate, but if you change it to like, do you think that race should play a factor in university admissions, then it plummets, right? And then also you have actual referendums like we had last year in the election here in California about, restoring affirmative action, which, got trounced, right? And then a lot of the people who voted against it were Asian American. So I think that sort of liberal Asian Americans like to trot out those numbers and say, hey, we do support affirmative action. We're not all like this. But, the reality is that many are not. I would say the majority are not, but, many are, right? And dealing with the issue sort of requires like a more honest assessment of what's going on. In terms of what this movement is, a lot of it is online. A lot of it is through messaging apps. It started, the sort of most prominent version of it started with a skit on the Jimmy Kimmel show that was, pretty racist, I guess. And I don't know, it was pretty racist, right? I don't mean to like hedge here. It was pretty racist. And so, these Chinese community organizers started talking to each other on WeChat. They organized a big protest against the Jimmy Kimmel show. Jimmy Kimmel actually apologized, and off that victory, they moved into educational issues, and they grew and grew and grew, and they got in touch with Ed Blum, who is, the guy who was behind the affirmative action lawsuits at Harvard, UNC, Yale, some other schools as well. So they sort of are tapping into this conservative activist legal machine. There was a lot of crossover with the Peter Liang, Akai Gurley protests, which involved like an Asian cop who shot and killed a black person in a stairwell in New York City. I think there is a desire to sort of say that this is just like online ephemera, right? That nobody except these people actually think this, and that people are mistaking a lot of online activity for something that's real. But I don't know. I think that voting patterns right now, and just people that in your own life, but also like things like what happened with the proposition to restore affirmative action in California. I think it shows that, right, like this is actually a reflection of how a lot of people in the community do feel, and I think it's a real thing.
And it's certainly had an impact in New York City, where there's been a lot of talk about getting rid of whatever the exam that you have to take to get into the fancy public high schools in New York, because almost no Black and Latino students are at Bronx Science or Stuyvesant or Brooklyn Tech, and that hasn't happened. And I think in significant part, it's because there's been pretty staunch opposition from Asian American parents.
Yes, and also just because like some of the weird laws in New York State where the mayor can't actually overturn that without getting Cuomo to sign off on it, basically, because it was enshrined in state law. So that makes it a little bit more complicated. Yeah, the protests against ending the test as a SHSAT, right? The protests against ending those were pretty big. Did radicalize not radicalize, but it certainly activated a lot of Chinese parents who communicate with one another. In the article I wrote about this, right, it was like basically what happened was that there was at Bronx Science, there was a Chinese American homework group that the parents did just to make sure that they were keeping up on their kids' homework. And that homework group became like sort of the central hub of the anti-SHSAT stuff. So,
wow, rules for radicals.
Yeah, seriously.
Well, there's a lot of like that sort of organic organizing, I would say, is happening a lot right now. And, it's for the same reason that a lot of that type of organizing is happening right now, is that everyone's connected and they can talk to each other.
Andy, Tammy, does this add up potentially to a big problem potentially in where Asian Americans, or maybe we should specify in this case, Chinese Americans, are heading politically?
Yeah, I mean, it is an issue, I think, but I don't know what to do about it. And I'm sort of like, thank God I'm in my 30s. On the other hand, I have a daughter, so it'll come up again. But I'm glad I'm not applying to college right now in the midst of all this and having to take a stance on it right now. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely not going away, it seems like, right?
Yeah, it's very difficult to address, right? Covering the Harvard trial, the thing that kept bothering me was that everybody agrees that Harvard discriminates against Asian students, right? And maybe Tammy and Andy don't, but almost everyone agrees. Like the evidence is like overwhelming, and
because it's like notes and admissions files that are like, this person is a robot who is too type A and doesn't have emotions or an interior life.
It's not even stuff like that. It's like stuff where they would have different SAT cutoffs, for different people, and that the Asian will always be the highest SAT cutoff. And there are these ridiculous examples where, like, regionally speaking, right? Because Harvard also wants to be regionally diverse, right? So white people count as regionally diverse, but Asian people don't count as regionally diverse. And so like 2 students could be in, let's say, I don't know, what is a place that doesn't send a lot of people to Harvard? I don't mean to be like
Appalachia.
Yeah, Appalachia, or let's say Alaska or something like that. They could be sitting next to each other in the classroom. One is counted as regionally diverse, the other is not. And the reason why the person is not counted as regionally diverse is because they're Asian, right? That's discrimination by any definition. Of course they discriminate against Asian students. Now, the problem is that all these parents also know that they discriminate against Asian people, right? And then they look at the sort of opposition side and everyone's saying, wait, what do you mean they don't discriminate, right? And so then that leads to a real sort of deepening of reactionary politics and reactionary thought, I think, right? Because it is not a discussion and a debate. It is literally, these people are lying to me, so I'm going to listen to everything that the other side is telling me, right? At least they're being honest with us. At least they have our back. And I don't know how to fix that because I'm not like a liberal America spokesperson, nor do I have any influence over what they say. But it drove me crazy thinking about it, because I was like, well, there's no conversation here. Everyone knows one thing and they're saying another thing. And so, of course, the people who are affected by the one thing that everybody knows are going to basically get mad at the people who they think are lying to them, right?
And Jay, I mean, is the concern, because obviously we're talking about Harvard and Yale and we're talking about the specialized high school where so few people go, like period, right? And it's just hitting such an elite sphere. But that doesn't mean the families they're coming from are necessarily elite. I guess I'm just curious, like in your reporting, what you found in terms of like how this discourse affects poor and working class people and like their communities. And, because I think, is it just like an aspirational thing where even though statistically speaking, this actually affects like a super minority of people, it affects a much larger group because they all want their kids to go to these schools.
Right. And they also are all listening to the same, Chinese language or
WeChat room or whatever.
Right. Yeah. Or even the media, right? So they're not getting their media from NPR or, ABC. They're getting their media from Chinese language outlets, which talk about this stuff endlessly, and they do feel if they have kids, I'm sure they want their kids to go to these schools, right? And if they think they can't, right, even if they, kind of quietly think, I don't know if like Chiwei is going to make it here, they're like, well, I would at least like him to have a chance,
exactly,
right? So, I do think that I don't think it's something that only affects the types of people who would go to Harvard. And also, talking about Stuyvesant in these schools or even Lowell here in San Francisco, the Asian population is not particularly wealthy of the students who go there. And, a lot of them are people who have very solidly working class and undocumented backgrounds.
I think one hint here at how left politics might get around this racialized zero-sum scarcity politics is, what if all high schools were excellent, equally excellent, and integrated?
Yeah. Right.
Great.
Yeah.
We solved it. Great.
Yeah. Right.
That's the dream.
Yeah.
But as long as there are these weirdly, it's like, okay, most public schools are going to be deeply under-resourced and not prepare you to move forward in life. And we're going to have a small number that are really excellent. It seems like that's going to end poorly no matter what. And because of the way race operates in American capitalism, it's ending poorly in this very specific way that's pitting Black and Latino people against Asians.
That's why, I firmly believe, and I think probably all of us, that, those parts of, the Bernie-ish platform focusing on universal education would convert a lot of Asian American voters who are undecided between the parties, right? And if you focus on things like providing education and universal access to these kinds of upward mobility avenues, then that would speak to them in a way that's less about white supremacy and look how unracist our candidate is.
Yeah, if you looked at a lot of the conversation around anti-racism stuff in New York City, for example, under the old Chancellor Carranza, right? It was always about equity in these elite spaces. It was not really a radical vision at all. Right? Even though he would call himself a radical and people called him a radical in negative ways, right? It was just, how do we keep elite schools and how do we make them, have the right percentages that reflect the rest of the city? And I just, one of my frustrations, the way that anti-racism has functioned within education is just that you are dividing these groups, right? You are creating divisions within these groups. And yet you're offering no alternative than scarcity politics and exclusive, who gets into Harvard. And, I don't know. It seems like if you are the radical dude in that area, maybe you should think about that sort of stuff. But it never happens. It's equity within scarcity.
Yeah.
I'm Astrid Taylor, and you're listening to The Dig with Daniel Denvir, a podcast for people who want to deeply understand the world and organize to change it. That's why you should support the show at patreon.com/thedig.
This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by University of Guam Press, which has loads of great titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is The Properties of Perpetual Light by Julian Again. The Properties of Perpetual Light is an homage to the work of the activist writer. With prose and poetry both bracing and quiet, Again weaves together stories from his childhood in the villages of Guam with searing political commentary. Naomi Klein said about the book, "I did not know I needed this book until it had me in its embrace like the oldest and dearest of friends, from the very first page." Julian Again is also the founder of Blue Ocean Law, a progressive firm that works at the intersection of indigenous rights and environmental justice. Check out their important work at blueoceanlaw.com. The Properties of Perpetual Light by Julian Again, out now from University of Guam Press. We've talked a bunch about how we can't just invoke late 19th century anti-Asian racism to explain what's going on today, that there are these big disjunctures between pre and post 1965. But one thing that the Atlanta killings remind us is that a longstanding, I think seemingly permanent feature of anti-Asian racism has been how racism differentially sexualizes raced people by gender, and very much Asian Americans very much included. Going back to the early history, the first federal immigration restriction law before the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act was the Page Law in 1875, which specifically targeted Chinese women as prostitutes. And today, obviously, the place of Asian women in the American imaginary continues to be decisively shaped by particular ways that Asian women are sexualized. But there's also a flip side of this, which is the way that Asian American men are feminized and even desexualized in the popular imaginary. To what extent is this what we saw play out in Georgia? Where did this gender bifurcated construction of Asian sexuality come from? And short of like this horrific murder that happened, what are its concrete consequences for being an Asian American man or woman in America?
I think if we're going to talk about this, we should not try to veer into the realm of like purely it's about like the ideas in people's head and stereotypes and these ideas that have been passed down from generations. That there is since we know so little about the killer and the condition so far, I think one thing we could say is that the massage workers were placed in a situation that is reflective of maybe like a structural racism. I know we make fun of this term structural racism for being like kind of gibberish, but I think what we kind of mean is like there are economic and legal ways in which, like Asian women in this particular case of a particular class are kind of pushed into this, or not pushed into, right? Or kind of, there's a pattern that emerges where certain people kind of fill different roles in like the social labor, right? And so to go back to like the 19th century context, like, yes, there was this law against prostitution, but there actually was prostitution. Like, so we can't just like take this complete structural, socially constructivist approach and say it was completely made up. But there was prostitution because of migration patterns, laws against miscegenation. 80 to 90% of the Chinese workers were men, and brothels and opium dens were ways to kind of keep them entertained and occupied. And, this deals with like family migration patterns where, there's a debate among scholars about this, but the facts remain that these things really existed. So we don't want to kind of say like, well, it was just made up in the minds of these racist white legislators that were reacting to something that they thought was real. Obviously, they were racist at the same time, right? And this produces all sorts of stereotypes where they would see any Asian woman and assume that, she was a prostitute, which did not correspond to reality. So I think histories like that are useful in the sense that they can tell us, well, what is the kind of institutional, legal, economic basis for these things to emerge? The other example we talked about on our show was emerging histories of Korean sex workers for US soldiers that kind of had this afterlife of Korean women working in the sex industry in the United States after the Korean War. There was an op-ed by Mei Jiang in the New York Times. There was an article in Harper's where a graduate student, I forget her name, but she's working on this particular issue that comfort women stations for the Japanese military were kind of emulated by the United States military. And this has a direct lineage to the sort of United States domestic sex work industry with a lot of Korean immigrants. I think those histories are really useful. And then we can talk about sort of the sort of correspondence or the back and forth between stereotypes and material reality. And I think that then we can say like, well, what we do know is the shooter went to these places expecting sex, and why do these places exist in their particular way? Like maybe history can help fill in the blanks there, but I think we don't know yet if like he just like did this because he had a huge Asian fetish, which I think a lot of people were kind of psychologizing before we knew the details of the facts of the case.
But it's also not just that Asian women are sexualized. Like this murder looks like femicide all over the world. And there's all kinds of women who do really intimate caregiving and, different kinds of personal service labor that are brutalized and killed every day. And so I think I go back and forth on this because yes, I of course, like there are specific like racial stereotypes and fetishizations and that are historically inflected and that, kind of predominate in some sort of ambient, like psychological way. But I mean, the kind of reaction to the killings is like, of course, like, oh my God, Korean and Chinese immigrant women, like my family members. But also like, here's another murder of women by a man, which to me is like a global problem and is a thing that patterns itself every single day. And I think like people who organize in these spaces would say something similar that, yes, there's some specificity to it, but also it's just like a general problem of men's hatred of women and poor women and servile women, and I guess we've said this on our pod before, but yeah, the kind of like grand sweeping history through the comfort women stations all the way to Atlanta to me is, both true in some ways and just kind of over explains also in a way that makes me feel uncomfortable. And then lastly, I think with regards to the kind of this thing that's been said so many decades about how Asian men are, kind of feminized or not taken seriously, desexualized in American culture, I really think that's overstated. And I've always been very skeptical of that analysis.
We've been talking a lot about Asian American politics and the various manifestations. And one perhaps rather marginal one, but I think is one that's probably of particular interest to Dig listeners, Andy, you've written about, which is tankies. Who are tankies? And to what extent have diasporic Chinese people embraced tanky politics? And to the extent that they have, why?
Yeah, no, this is a huge thing that I think has surprised all of us, but at the same time, maybe we could look back and say, of course, this is going to happen. Because the factors behind it are kind of these big geopolitical ones, not necessarily like, again, like one person was charismatically persuading everyone. So in terms of Chinese diaspora, Brian Hugh of New Bloom wrote an article and, I talked to him about it, about the specific appeal of tankyism to Chinese diaspora. But I think it's actually more widespread than that. Tanky, the definition I've figured out based on Google searches is that it refers to people in the UK who supported the USSR in spite of the USSR's brutal tank-based suppression of Hungary in 1956, basically siding with a communist regime because you see it as like a check upon the capitalist world power, right? And this could, similar phenomenon, applies to Latin American politics, Middle East politics. In terms of East Asia, the first time I really heard about this phenomenon was in 2019, when Hong Kong's protests were in the news. And I just kind of thought it was a no-brainer that you should support Hong Kong if they want greater political democratic rights, even though I think the movement does have a lot of right-wing elements to it. And a lot of people were against Hong Kong because they thought that you'd have to support China no matter what. And this was like kind of mind-blowing to me at the time. At the time, all we saw was like footage of like brutal police violence. And I thought, this is kind of undeniable. I think what's really going on, though, I think more broadly, is that people are not taking this position necessarily because they know anything about China. In fact, like what was most confusing to me at first was that the people who speak out on this issue very often obviously do not speak the Chinese language, understand Chinese media, studied China, right? They were political activists in like who focus on other things. So I think the main appeal again is just this idea that, you know, we're in a world post Cold War where the United States is the sort of unquestioned hegemon into the foreseeable future. There are no political alternatives. China seems to be the only one that poses some sort of check upon the United States. And so you can kind of project all of your kind of hopes and fears and, you know, and fantasies of an alternate political universe onto China. And so they've kind of occupied this space where I think, you know, like Venezuela was before and like Syria was before. And it's interesting because, you know, I've heard we talked with a group of activists, Lao San, who are like Hong Kong diasporic activists, who've given this anecdote. Edward Wong gave this anecdote that he was trying to organize an activity, a movement for sort of an activity in support of Hong Kong and Canada, and it was the Chilean activists who were really against it. And they talked to them and they kind of heard each other's side, and ultimately they just felt like their feelings for United States imperialism overruled any feelings. It's like they understood where the Hong Kong activists were coming from, but for them, like the number one most important issue was their feelings towards United States imperialism in Latin America. So I think that's kind of part of the appeal, that it's anti-imperialism that has gone very far. And I'm at the point now where I kind of think, you know, like there's only so much we can do. A lot of people are coming to this conclusion, you know, beyond the control of podcasts and blog posts, you know, like like a lot of domestic socialist.
Beyond the control of podcasts. God.
I know. They're omnipotent. Yeah, like there are domestic socialist groups in the United States who honestly, like their view on China doesn't really matter, right? Like they're mostly focused on domestic issues, but they do have, you know, they've taken like the Atlanta shootings and run with it and talked about how this is about how we shouldn't demonize China and the CCP, and how the Atlanta shootings were the fault of the Biden administration for taking a hard line on China, you know. But they've otherwise like talked about how like Tiananmen and Xinjiang and Hong Kong, they've been basically denialists about these things.
Yeah, they've had a field day on Twitter, and I've seen a lot more tankies than ever before show up in my feed because they have points that they can make about this, where they have, you know, screenshots of things, anti-China things that liberal politicians have said next to what's happened in Georgia. And it's something that's compelling to anyone on the left, not just a tanky. But you would have to scroll down their timeline to see that they're denying that anything wrong is happening with Uyghurs, for example.
And to be clear, like 5-10% of me gets it. You know, I'm like, yeah, like there's a lot of hypocrisy with the United States. I'm not a fan of the United States as an unchecked, indefinite global hegemon either.
But it's a problem if your anti-imperialism is not rooted in some kind of solidarity with actual human beings that exist in other countries. If it's just sort of abstracted to the level of statecraft, there's something inhumane, just like kind of counter to the kind of humanism that has to be to undergird all left politics, I feel like. But to what
I wonder if it's generational. I've heard like a lot of younger activists and college students it's more widespread among them, maybe in our generation, because I don't know, we were like slightly post-Cold War. It's less thinkable. But I think maybe as people's memory of the Cold War fades and they just kind of think about they're sick of American empire, you know, ad nauseum, then maybe this this position has more traction.
Yeah, when I was a young leftist in the late 90s, no one was trying to tell me that Stalin did nothing wrong. That was not a talking point. But Andy, to what extent because I've been aware of tankies for quite a few years, but to what extent is this something that's appealing disproportionately or particularly in some way to Chinese Americans or diasporic Chinese generally?
I think there is a version of it that's different than the one that I hear is in the DSA, for instance. I think I think for like, not to like throw shade at the whole, like I just hear like these tendencies among American leftists that, you know, for them, it's like China is this, you know, for like non-Chinese people, it's like, you know, they just hear these stories and they have this choice, like, do you believe the corporate United States media or do you believe this like edgy alternate media source? They choose the latter, right? I think for Chinese, the Chinese diaspora I've seen who have this tendency, they don't see themselves as tanky, right? They just see themselves as kind of saying like they feel like they're under attack by the West. They feel like you have to have a more sober picture, and you could honestly paint a tanky picture. Not, I mean, in other words, like another problem is like the word tanky is so derogatory. Like, I think for them they're nationalists, and like we which is a more neutral sounding phrase. Like they feel like if you read Chinese media and like follow the story from the Chinese side, and there's all this stuff that the rest of the world, the West, doesn't understand about my country or my people. That's a fair position. I think a lot of people feel, and they're not necessarily denying anything bad is happening in Xinjiang. They would just say like, but this is an issue that we're going to take care of, and many Uyghurs are totally okay with the CCP, which is true. And instead of having sanctions, we should like work towards some sort of cooperative solution, and so on and so forth, right? And so they would be kind of like have a softer version of just kind of nationalism. And but I think the roots are the same, right? There's this sense of like the West just gets to make all the rules, and they're hypocritical about it. There's this last week there was a big controversy that the Chinese government and Chinese celebrities what's the word, disowned or rebuked global brands such as H&M and Burberry because they had criticized Xinjiang cotton sourcing. And a lot of the tweets you would see were like, they would talk about United States slavery and you're right, like African chattel slavery, as it's hypocritical for the United States to criticize us over how we grow cotton when you guys had this history. And that's like pretty intense stuff, right? And but I think like it's a view that, I mean, I think it appeals to a lot of people who feel like this is about United States hypocrisy and less about anything that China does.
It reminds me of like what Japan did, and before in the pre-war period, where so much of the messaging that they were putting out to the rest of Asia that they had colonized was essentially that like America is so racist, at least let's, and maybe this was a moment of attempted construction of like an Asian
Definitely.
something.
The co-prosperity sphere is what they called it, right?
That was Asian solidarity.
Right. But they would say like, look at American slavery, And then a lot of the pressure of why those immigration laws changed was because it was very effective to say like, how could you ever ally or even feel ambivalent about the West? They won't even let you in, like they have specific laws about keeping you out. And that sort of became very complicated, post-Korean War and during the Vietnam War as well, where, after the Korean War, how do you make a message to, this colony in South Korea, essentially, that you've created, or this, place that you've occupied, when you don't allow any of those people in, right? And that created a lot of the pressure, along with a lot of Jewish legislators in the United States who were, very aware that a lot of the other rules were about, when they say no Eastern and Southern Europeans, right? Like they know exactly what that means. That those dual pressures were really what kind of changed the immigration laws in the United States.
In 1965 and going back to 1943, when Chinese exclusion was officially repealed, even though it didn't allow very many Chinese people to come in, that was a time when China was supposed to be a U.S. wartime ally against Japan. So it was sort of awkward to have Chinese exclusion on the books.
Right. And that was when Japan was peppering China with how could you be an ally with these people who are so racist against you? And then weirdly, the author Pearl S. Buck did a lot of the work, for changing a lot of this stuff and sort of, basically making that argument on the American side, just being like, well, how can we possibly ask these people to stand with us when we have these types of deeply racist immigration laws?
She's amazing. And she and her husband did extraordinary work on the left in publishing and organizing, supporting movements here and abroad.
You need to do a Pearl Buck episode.
I mean, yeah, she's incredible.
A big part of Asian Americans' class position as a cultural object in this country is the notion of Asians being a model minority. And it's an idea that emerged historically alongside the end of all of these racist immigration laws restricting or excluding Asians from entering the United States. What can we learn from this history, and particularly all of the explicit and implicit negative comparisons to Black people that the model minority idea entails? Does it just recapitulate the story of white ethnic grandchildren of Southern or Eastern European immigrants pulling themselves up out of the ghetto by their bootstraps and then becoming white, or something more particular going on with the Asian model minority idea and the way that it's conveys a certain racism against Black Americans in particular?
Well, so the brief background is that I think that that idea is most concretely crystallized in the Moynihan report, the famous Moynihan report, right? That talks about how irresponsible Black families are, and by contrast, Asian American families are better. The other thing that was going on was that this was part of a Cold War idea that we need to show that Asians can succeed. Asian countries, so like Taiwan and South Korea, where our parents came from, and also Asian Americans can succeed, and you don't need socialism, you don't need a revolution, right? You can thrive in a capitalist society. I wonder if the model minority moment has kind of passed now, for all those reasons we've just talked about, with affirmative action debates, anti-China economic fears these days, where China is kind of seen as, well, Asian Americans, Asians, China, whatever, right, are seen as too mobile. Like, whoa. Like, they're not happy that Asians are succeeding in a white dominated society. They're actually kind of afraid that they're going to succeed too much. So I almost wonder model minority was very much a real thing, but I almost wonder if now we can look back on it as a moment we're in a different period by now. But I mean,
I don't know, because these right-wing dudes, these right-wing Asian dudes, like there's one who was just on Tucker Carlson. He's sort of like the young right-wing charismatic guy that they're going to try and put out in front of everything. Their argument is like model minority is good. They're and they make all the implicit racist arguments, except they make them explicitly, right? They're basically just like, well, these people can't get in because they don't work as hard, because they don't have, and they almost race themselves in this really fascinating way, where like a guy I interviewed for a long time and who I still talk to from time to time, although I think right now he's very mad at me, but like he wrote a book called, The 5 Confucian Secrets to Chinese American Success. I don't know if that's the exact title, but, it was essentially being like, we have these traditions, and they're ingrained in us, and that's why we succeed. And America should accept us and not be racist towards us, because we can contribute to America, in these sorts of ways. And it's like academics and hard work, and we can teach you white Americans how to be more like us. And then, I of course asked him when I was talking to him, I was like, well, okay, like, well, what do you think the characteristics of other races are and what they can contribute? And he's like, well, sports and music, it's like, all right,
Oh no.
And so like this idea that the future, I think, of this sort of group, right, is not going to be resisting the model minority myth or talking about it in any sort of way. I think they're just going to inhabit it, and they're going to say the model minority myth is good. It's not a myth. We are the model minority. And that, of course, that's been a function of right-wing Asian politics forever, but it's never been this visible or this explicit, I think, right? And, it used to be that like a right-wing Asian person was John Yoo or something like that, right? Or a neoconservative. And they would ally themselves, with those groups, and that they would try and be raceless, right? That's not true anymore. Like, this is a new form of identity politics that is coming out that is essentially model minority good. So anyway, I agree that I think that like the sort of conversation about it is outdated. But I also think that like we have to like acknowledge that the right is the ascending right is kind of just being like, yeah, cool, model minority. What are you talking about? That shit's awesome.
Maybe it started with Amy Chua's book.
Yeah, is Tiger Mom a turning point?
That was the most it was a liberal leaning in to this right-wing idea that Jay just mentioned.
Because it seems like historically it was an idea developed for white Americans, but for very obvious reasons, it could be a very attractive idea for Asian immigrants and Asian Americans. Like why many people of many groups would respond well to being told that your group is one of the best or the best group.
Right. And also like an arbiter of what is right and what's wrong. Right. So if you watch that Tucker Carlson, I don't mean to place too much on one Tucker Carlson interview, but Tucker Carlson interviewed James Rufo, or I think his name is Christopher Rufo, the guy who does all the anti-critical race theory stuff. Christopher Rufo's big thing in that segment was talking about how the people who will save us from critical race theory are the Asian Americans. And because they don't stand for it when it comes to their schools, right? Like they'll act, which is actually down in the peninsula here in the Bay Area, it's true. Like there was some sort of curriculum in Asian American parents got it thrown out, at a very, very highly dense Asian American school. And so like the narrative on the right now is essentially like, we need you to save us because white people are too ensconced in white guilt and they won't do anything about it because they're petrified. But you people, you can just say this shit, and no one can say anything to you because you're not white. And you're not embarrassed by it, And so it's just fascinating to watch now. I don't mean to laugh about it because, part of the reason why I pay so much attention to it is because I think it's going to be extremely effective, right? Like who doesn't, like you said, Dan, like who doesn't like being told, oh, actually, everything about you is great and like sets you up for success. And everything else about all the other people who are getting in your way is like, pathological and bad, It's a appealing message. And, I don't exactly know how to combat it, but, it's certainly something that I think the right is gearing up to do right now.
Jay, you wrote, quote, "If the Democratic Party wants to disaggregate immigrant populations from one another, they must take a difficult, clear look at the dynamics between these groups and come up with a broad message that tries to find pockets of mutual interest. Broad anti-racist and anti-xenophobic messaging will not work for growing populations who mostly see themselves outside of America's racial hierarchy, or, in many cases, believe their interests align better with middle-class white voters. The Republican Party's message of hard work, capitalism, and freedom makes sense to large portions of the immigrant population. In fact, it's why many of them, including my uncle and many of his fellow kitchen workers, chose to plant roots in the country. Democrats must find a similarly broad platform that focuses on the needs of working-class immigrants for health care, access to quality education, and other universal programs. Those of us who have assimilated into the professional class must commit treason against people of color, in quotations, and help build a coalition of working-class immigrants, from Guatemalan workers in fish processing plants and Bangladeshi cab drivers to Chinese and Vietnamese restaurant workers and Mexican farm workers. To close out, Bernie did really well among Asian Americans in the Democratic primary, and he did really well, of course, among Latinos as well, two groups that in the general election moved towards Trump. That doesn't mean, of course, that it was like the same Asian or same Latino Bernie primary voters who then voted for Trump in the general. But do you think that Bernie began to articulate the sort of left politics that you're talking about that can resonate with Asian voters in a way that whatever the standard liberal race talk has not?
For sure. And I mean, Nevada was, one of the most hopeful, Nevada primary, I think for a lot of us was one of the most hopeful political moments, of our lives, right? Where you do see this coalition building, where you do see people from different backgrounds coming together with shared interests. And yeah, I think that informed a lot of what I was thinking when I wrote that. It was also, like my mentor in a lot of ways, Noel Ignatieff, and that line like treason towards people of color is an adaptation of his slogan, treason against the white race. It was my personal adaptation as, somebody who is not white and therefore cannot commit treason against the white race. But what is sort of the hegemonic structure in my life that I think it keeps lower class and working class people, of my people, right, but also of all people down. And I do think that the disconnect at that point was, that broad anti-racist language, broad sort of, POC type of language that is mostly rooted in the concerns of a upwardly ascending group of people, that is always going to leave behind like the working class people, and that it is not outside of like the immorality of it, right? Which I think is a huge part of it, right? Like you have to make that argument that pragmatically it also doesn't make sense, right? Because then what are your actual politics then, right? Except to sort of continue to engage in capitalism and whatever, neoliberal identity politics. And so my thought there was just like, there needs to be a hard break, right? Like there can't be a reform of POC. There can't be a reform of these types of identity politics. There needs to be some sort of real reckoning with it, and perhaps even necessitate some sort of destruction of the past ways in which we thought about it. And I do think that, I think that what happened in Nevada certainly would with the Bernie campaign would certainly fall in line with that. Look at the hope and the sort of the excitement, and look at the photos of the people who were there, and ask yourself if that's the vision that you want for the country, right? Or do you want these endless sort of like litigations of like identity and what race means? And I think that the answer for many people would be that they want that, right? And it was for many people. But I do think that it requires a lot of people like myself to just sort of realize that like this version of success is not really working for me either, you know, right? Like I've done well in my career, and you know, like I've done everything that I was supposed to do, and yet I feel no liberation. Right? I only feel economic liberation, which is obviously conditional upon other people suffering. And so, yeah, I think the treason thing came from like Noel Ignatieff and like the Sojourner Truth Society and that type of thinking.
Yeah, Andy and Tammy. And one thing I'll add is that there was a ton of attention justly paid to how well Bernie did amongst Latino voters, but very little written on his success with Asian American voters, even though every poll I could find in a variety of states, it was like in California, it was like Bernie way ahead and then second Bloomberg at some point. I don't know what that poll was taken, but it's sort of...
Asians are so weird.
That tells the whole story.
I felt like I was like, there it is.
That's the whole episode.
I could just say, you know, I talked to a young Asian American woman who worked for Bernie, Brooke Adams, and kind of read her those UCLA polls studies that were done in the summer of 2020 that did the sort of summary of Asian and Latino voters and how much they preferred Bernie. And she, you know, in terms of like why that was the case, right? Like they didn't have any sort of grand unifying theory. She just kind of brought back the anecdote of her mom, who was a Republican voting Taiwanese immigrant who was kind of swayed by this discussion of opportunity and education. And, you know, a lot of Taiwanese immigrants of that generation, including my own, were Republican just out of reflex. And I think my parents were more like, Trump's a pig. That was more like compelling for them than the other message. But I do think like, you know, this message of like education, health, like Taiwan, for instance, has universal healthcare and a very successful history of public education. And they would totally agree that those are like a no-brainer for a civilized society. So when you bring it to that, as opposed to like some Cold War rhetoric about socialism versus capitalism, it's the former kind of concrete stuff that I think really appeals to a lot of immigrants that might be on the fence.
Yeah, with Koreans, it's like it's the same thing where it's, you know, but it's the opposite sort of where many of the Koreans who immigrated to this country escaped from, as is now everybody knows because they've watched Parasite, I guess, but, you know, like a viciously class-based society. You know, I always thought that type of message would be clarifying and edifying for people who, you know, escaped that. And a lot of the reason they came to the United States, you can say, is to be capitalists, but it was also because they had no opportunity at all because of Korea's economic structure.
More generally, though, I think the story of Asian Americans is still to be determined because there's still lots of other signs that they were leaning more Democrat and leftist over the past decade before this election. Generally, I think they've been progressively more Democratic over the last few cycles, and you also have prominent people like Ron Kim, Yulin Nyo, Andrew Yang, right? So there.
Andrew
there
Yang.
Don't put him in there.
You could have said Jane Kim. You know, you could have said a lot of other people. Yeah.
Jane Kim, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, I think there are more optimistic signs also, right?
And we've only been talking about East Asians, but South Asians tend to vote quite
Rakana,
liberal.
Right? Yeah. Right.
Except those in the Howdy Modi.
Right.
Well, a lot of people, though, they
rally.
support Modi,
Yeah.
but then they vote Democrat solidly here. You know, we're just full of contradictions.
Yeah.
Multitudes. Well, Andy Liu, Jay Caspian Kang, Tammy Kim, thank you all very much.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. That was fun.
Andy Liu is a historian of modern China and the author of Tea-War, A History of Capitalism in China and India. Tammy Kim is a freelance writer and contributor to New York Times Opinion. Jay Caspian Kang is a writer-at-large for New York Times Magazine, and his new book, The Loneliest Americans, will be published this fall. Thank you for listening to The Dig from Jacobin Magazine. As Marx once said, after noting that xenophobia is the secret of the impotence of the English working class, It is the secret by which the capitalist class maintains its power. While other podcasts have only interpreted the world in various ways, our point is to change it. We're posting new episodes every week. The Dig was produced by Alex Lewis, music by Jeffrey Brodsky. Our communications coordinator is Izzy Olive. Our senior advisor is Thea Riofrancos. Check out our vast archives at thedigradio.com. Follow us on Twitter at @TheDigRadio, and please find us wherever you get podcasts and subscribe to this podcast. If it's on iTunes or wherever, please also consider leaving us a very friendly review. Those reviews help introduce us to new listeners, ostensibly. But I think what really does that is you telling people that you know in real life about why you listen to the show, why you like it, why they should listen to it, while they'll like it. Please do make propaganda for us, and do find us at patreon.com and make a monthly contribution to keep this operation up and running strong. Even a few bucks is huge.